Hello, welcome everyone. Kelly, I think you might be muted. We're now streaming live on Facebook, and I'm so excited that we have Kelly and Meredith here talking to us about navigating November, 7 things tech startups need to know about the 2020 election and beyond. My name is Rachel Koretsky. I'm coming to you live from WeWork in downtown. We're on the Rhode Island WeWork. First, thank you so much for joining us. DC Startup Week is a 5-day conference every September. We're in day 1. We're focused on building the startup community here in the DMV. We want to give a quick shout out and thank you to our title sponsors, Next, Insperity, Wiz, and Technology Rivers. If you have any questions throughout the talk, please put an all caps question at the start of the chat to make sure that we don't miss anything. We're so excited to have Kelly as well as Meredith here today at DC Startup Week. So please join me in welcoming Kelly and Meredith to the DC Startup Week stage.
Hello, everyone. Okay, great. Meredith, can you say hello for 1 second just to make sure that I've got you?
Yes, can you hear me?
Okay, great. Yes, awesome. Yes. Okay. Thank you, everyone. We're both really excited to be a part of DC Startup Week. It's an organization that is just near and dear to both of our hearts. And I've been involved for a while, so just another shout out to all of the organizers. I know that there's been some tireless work gone into everything here. So very quickly, first, I'm Kelly Miller, and both of us, Meredith and I, work at FTI Consulting. I am on the Telecom, Media, and Technology team, that's TMT. And I've also been really involved in the DC startup community. So I've probably met a few of you through various events. I've worked with Techstars, with SeedSpot, with 1 Million Cups, and with DC Startup Week before. And also in 2018, I wrote a book for bootstrap startups called Get Attention. So both tech and startups world, really passionate about both of them. Meredith, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hey, everyone. So happy to be here. Big thanks to DC FinTech Week. FinTech Week. I'm already moving along to next month, Startup Week. Thank you so much for having us. I'm excited about FinTech. That's an area that I have some experience in. So as you can see, it's top of mind. And just like Kelly, I work at FTI Consulting, and I am in the financial services practice. So my experience has primarily been in the area of financial services and the intersection of politics and communications and outreach. I've had the great experience of working on Capitol Hill on the Education and Labor Committee, and then also in the Obama administration at the Department of Labor. So I have a little bit different perspective than Kelly, but I think what we've put together today will be really interesting for you guys. So we'll move right along. So here's a little bit about our company, FTI Consulting. We are experts with impact. We are an independent global advisory firm with tons of employees. In fact, we have 5,800 of us. We're located in 84 cities in 27 countries. We have experts in a variety of different sectors. And as you can see here, the five areas that are within this diagram, where Kelly and I sit is in the strategic communications sector. Both of us work in the public affairs area, and we work to advise and help companies figure out the best way to communicate whatever it is they're looking to do, whether it's dealing with a reputational risk, a political risk, maybe unveiling a new product or launching something different. That's where our expertise comes into play. So we'll move right along to the next slide. Kelly?
Yeah, so if everyone could just kind of type into the chat, I have a kind of couple questions to read the room a bit. I know, we can't do the typical hand raising in person, so there's a chat function should be at the bottom of everyone's screen. So the first thing I just wanted to ask everyone is how closely are you following the election? Okay, we've got every day following pretty closely. I know this is a DC-centric audience, so that doesn't surprise me at all, somewhat more than normal. And I think that the presidential election is pretty much on, it's on many people's radar every 4 years, but I think, especially folks in DC, especially folks with a startup, you know, there's a lot at stake. So, so very interesting to know. And not an expert, but definitely tracking the headlines. Okay, great. So I know that we have some folks, you know, lobbyists, very, you know, DC living or dying by what's happening on the Hill folks that probably know way more ins and outs than I might even. And then we have, you know, some people who are really kind of trying to, you know, figure out what this means for their business, what this means for moving forward. So the next question is, how much impact do you believe the election could have on startups and small businesses? I think that this question is not always asked, and I'm very curious to hear, you know, what's on everyone's radar. So minimal impact in the short term. That's a really good point. We're going to talk a bit about, you know, transitions today. Depends on the industry. I think that's also, yeah, I'm seeing a question about, you know, that vary from maybe not as impactful for small businesses, but larger industries might have a bit more of an impact. Tax consequences, that's definitely something that we're going to just very lightly touch on, but certainly, you know, another topic for another day. So yes. And then what is the top issue you anticipate for startups and small businesses in 2021? And this can be connected to the election or not. Financial and tech pathways, yep, financial services. This is great. This is a lot of the things we're going to talk about today. Available capital for small businesses. We're going to talk a bit about, you know, we're going to talk about the CARES Act, and then we're also going to talk about how, you know, issues like antitrust for larger companies might have an impact on, you know, funding and acquisitions for smaller companies as well. Okay, great. Well, yeah, thank you all. It's really helpful to start to get to know everyone. And I know people are still kind of filing in, so so really appreciate that background. And I think that Meredith and I will be able to speak to a lot of the issues that were brought up.
Great. Thanks, Kelly. So before we get started into sort of what are the 7 things that tech startups need to be aware of navigating the election and beyond, first, we're going to give you just a brief overview on the 2020 election. So really, there's 3 main areas that we're focused here on the federal level. First is Donnie from Queens versus Uncle Joe. So this is the presidential election. You've probably heard so much about what's going on with the election. So we'll cover that, as well as talking about the House and the Senate, and you know where we see both of those elections going. So what we know right now from the data is that Biden is up nationally and up in swing states. His lead isn't strong enough that, you know, we could sit here and say that the election is going to be decided today or tomorrow. And a lot of his lead is also within the margin of error, which means it really could go either way. What we do know is that in many of these swing states, which are battleground states and states that can go in either direction, those states are also the most important for a presidential election, because you need to get to 270 of these electoral votes. And you probably have heard that term used very broadly, but those states can go either way. And so we do know that Biden is up from where Hillary Clinton was 4 years ago. But again, you can't take anything for granted. One of the most important things that I think most folks who follow campaigns and elections will tell you that it really comes down to turnout. If either of the campaigns can get more people out, then that will definitely impact what the results of the election will be. And this year will be quite interesting, as we all know, with the ongoing pandemic, that a lot of voting will happen whether via mail, so people requesting ballots as opposed to going in person. And then there's also this idea that perhaps the election could be contested. And what that means is maybe it becomes very close. Maybe there are reports that there's some shenanigans going on and that the results couldn't be trusted. Some of these themes are being perpetrated by one side over the other, but it's certainly possible, and it's certainly possible that we might not know the results of the presidential election on Election Day. In the House of Representatives, there's a very likely chance the Democrats will maintain their majority and perhaps expand it. So I think that's, that's sort of a theme that most people would agree with. The Senate is a little bit more interesting. You've got currently 53 Republican seats, 45 Democrat. So there is a 6-seat majority with Republicans, and no, my math is not wrong. Not including the 2 independents there that that are not included. But that's really, if Democrats want to gain control of the Senate, they really need those sort of 6 seats. And so depending on where you look for your information, it's roughly anywhere between 6 or 7 currently held Republican seats or seats that should be held Republican are possibly a toss-up and possibly leaning Democratic. So the Senate will be very interesting to watch. And I'll leave you with the thought that a flip to a Democratic majority is possible. But again, it'll all come down to turnout and sort of where we are in November. Some other things to keep in mind for 2021, the themes are definitely going to be all about COVID mitigation and COVID recovery. So what are going to be the possible programs or funding that will help out businesses and individuals to deal with the impact that COVID has had? We'll see that on both sides, whether it's a President Biden or if it's President Trump. The first 100 days will be definitely very interesting to pay attention to. That's usually when there's a lot of focus around 100 days and sort of what can be accomplished. And sometimes that's legislative, but mostly it's referring to what exactly a president can do. And usually that is in the form of issuing an executive order. So the president has lots of authority to decide what sort of themes that he or she wants to push forward. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that you hear a lot about campaign rhetoric versus governing. And really what that means is there's a lot of promises that can be made during an election. And a lot of that is to garner votes, is to increase support for your candidacy. But sometimes that doesn't actually turn into governing. One of a great example that you might all be familiar with was, Trump really focused heavily on the issue of building the wall. And so as we know that there's maybe just a couple miles completed of the wall, and there was all fights regarding funding of the wall. So that was a big campaign promise that he had, but unfortunately it was not, it didn't actually happen the way that I think that he wanted. And so Kelly, will you review the 7 things we need to know?
Yes. So I'll walk through these very quickly now, but we're going to be spending a little bit of time on each one. And one thing that I wanted to note is that as we're going through, I think it'd be easier if we could take questions at the end. But if a question pops in your head, feel free to enter it into the chat box, and then we can kind of go through those at the end to make sure that we have time to focus on each of these 7 issues because they're all really important. So the first we have is the difference between a divided versus a unified government, how regulatory sandboxes and innovation offices can help guide your regulatory path. Third is the rapid change and uncertainty of privacy. Fourth is FTC leadership and handling of data breaches. Fifth, potential for increased antitrust scrutiny. Sixth, complications and barriers to content regulation. And then finally, we're going to go over the CARES Act and kind of general pandemic response and how that should be considered.
Great, thank you, Kay. So the first thing we'll talk about is the differences between a divided and unified government. So as sort of the name suggests, divided means that the party control is divided. And that could mean that maybe the presidency is Republican, the House is Democrat, the Senate is Republican. It just means that they're not all the same. And then unified certainly means that you've got, either a Democratic majority in both houses and the presidency, or a Republican in all of them. what is interesting about a divided government ability is that the minority, so the party that maybe doesn't hold all the power, certainly has some tools at their disposal to exert influence. And on the unified front, that can be very challenging for the party that's not in control. They lack the tools that they need to exert as much influence as they can. Now, in the House and the Senate, there are certainly mechanisms for the minority to have some ability to influence maybe a legislative process, but it's not significant. So as you can see, if you have a unified government under one party, you'll see major changes. Great example is previously when the Democrats held the House and the Senate and President Obama had the presidency, you saw some major legislative things happen. The Dodd-Frank Act, the Affordable Care Act, big bills like that do happen when there is a unified party under control. So as far as what does that mean for legislation? Well, in a divided government, sure, more compromise is definitely required, whereas there are limited constraints for a unified party. So legislatively, you can really kind of do whatever it is that you wish. On the flip side of that is just because one party has control doesn't mean that everybody's going to agree on what the direction should be. So that's where sometimes you'll see a lot of party infighting. Regulatory implications. So what's happening at the agencies? When it's divided government, often there's a lot more oversight of what's happening in the administration, and that's a tool that Congress will use to ensure that the administration is following the rules, or if they're not following the rules, they want to call them out and make them aware. And then if there is a unified government, as far as regulatory implications, there's often more opportunity to pursue your policy agenda at an agency. Okay, so what does this really mean for tech startups, right? Just sort of a summation of what I just talked about. Under divided, parties can share control of the policy direction, whereas in unified, one party dictates that direction. And so here's what you really need to do. You need to understand and plan for the impact both scenarios might have on your business. If having a Republican majority is more friendly to your business model, then you need to make sure that you can plan for the situation where it could possibly be a Democratic majority, and what does that mean for you? So I think you need to think through, what are the issues that are important to me, and sort of where do the parties fall with issues that impact my business. You need to learn about who the influential regulators are and who those policymakers are. The regulators that we're going to talk about today specifically is the Federal Trade Commission, which we think is the most relevant for tech startups, but there are other agencies throughout the government that are also important, and it's something for you to think about, that you can engage with them. You can, talk about your business and have meetings and ask for feedback and have an open dialogue. And same thing with policymakers. What are the congressional committees that on Capitol Hill that are most relevant to your business and to your work? And figuring out who that is, and then which members of Congress, maybe they don't serve on that committee, but maybe there's a member who is the trailblazer that is really supportive of what you're trying to do. But it's also important to know who the adversaries are as well. And you just sort of, as I mentioned, considering engagement, meeting with members of Congress is something certainly you can do, but that's definitely something you should think if you're looking for that kind of engagement. So the next thing we'll talk about, I think, is actually our number two, how regulatory sandboxes and innovation offices can help guide your regulatory path. So what is a regulatory sandbox? It's not full of sand, and it doesn't have all sorts of ways to build sandcastles in it, but it's basically a framework. And this I want to just clarify, this is a little bit more focused towards fintech in terms of the regulatory sandbox, but we'll get into how that's relevant for other types of businesses and startups as well. But it basically allows for fintechs to come in and speak with a regulator and kind of in a controlled environment, either run an experiment. They're basically, you're taking your business and you're bringing it to the government. And because a lot of times with some startups, fintechs especially, you might not be in a zone that is normally regulated by the federal government. And so that creates a lot of uncertainty for you and for the federal government and for other regulators who may have an interest in what your business is doing. This creates sort of an environment where you can share information, you can get feedback, you can understand, you know, where the lines are drawn, or if the lines aren't drawn, try to figure out the best way to go forward. So the only official regulatory sandbox is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau at the federal level. Internationally, the United Kingdom launched theirs in 2015, and there are other international bodies as well. But also at the state level, a few of the states that I mentioned here have established their own regulatory sandboxes, and they also tend to work together on a multi-state collaborative. So even if you know, for example, aren't based out of one of these states, it doesn't mean that you couldn't try to have a conversation to learn more about what their process is and how that could help you. And here is also a list of the other innovation offices across the federal government. And a lot of these offices also meet with businesses that are outside the scope of their jurisdiction. So the CFTC is the agency that I used to work at, and they are a wonderful group of people who are interested in learning about what your business can bring to the table. And even if it doesn't fit exactly in the lines of the jurisdiction, they still want to hear, because at the end of the day, what you're doing could impact the marketplace, and then down the road, impact the markets that the CFTC regulates. Also, Kelly and I don't know if we had mentioned this yet, but we're planning to put this presentation into a document that we'd love to share with you. So please feel free to drop your email address into the chat box as well, so we can connect with you. There'll be a lot of information here that I'm sure you guys will want to follow up on afterwards. So feel free to do that. And real quickly, here are some of the benefits of engagement. So as you know, the innovations that you're working on outpaces regulation. So some of the regulation out there may not apply to you. And this opportunity of engaging with a regulator will help you to stay in the lines. And if the lines aren't drawn, again, you might have the opportunity to actually help draw those lines. And for you, as you know, the startup, engaging will help you with reducing sort of a regulatory fear, regulatory uncertainty that may exist. Because again, if your company is doing something totally different and new, there might not be parameters within the government's confines on regulation. And as I mentioned, also, you're able to share developments, solicit feedback, possibly influence the process. And maybe some of the issues you might not be aware of, the regulators will help bring your attention to. You know, one of the most important things for federal regulators is, of course, making sure that consumers are protected and that and as well as customers. So perhaps there might be some areas maybe where you haven't fully thought something through, or you want to figure out what's the best way to serve your customers. That's something that these regulators can assist with. And then finally, just sort of like that sandbox model of running experiments or receiving temporary relief, so you don't actually, you get a kind of a pass on following the rules because you're in the stage of development. So we're going to move along to Kelly.
Great. So next up is consumer privacy. Who doesn't love to talk about this stuff? So consumer privacy is you know, an issue that for both startups and big tech alike, it's been impacted in the past couple of years for a number of reasons. As you know, many of the biggest tech outfits are mostly free for users. If you know, we're thinking of the social media especially. So data is leveraged in a variety of ways and is becoming kind of as important as ever. And consumers in general are just becoming more conscious of how data is used, how it's valued, and how we view our own privacy. So the first item to be aware of, so yeah, there are already a few key foreign, national, and international privacy legislation changes in motion. Let me also preface by saying that consumer privacy challenges and regulation for tech companies could be an entire presentation on its own, but today I'm just going to kind of cover the basics. So up first, and probably one that most folks recognize the most, is GDPR. GDPR is the General Protection Regulation. It's a regulation in EU law that, that gives control to individuals over their personal data. So this was adopted by European Parliament in April 2016, and provisions became applicable in May 2018. So of all the major privacy changes that we've seen, this is the one that both tech and consumers have kind of lived with for the longest. So we have a little bit of a better sense for how this is enforced, how companies can be compliant, and how this really kind of works out in the real world, rather than just the law itself. That said, things are still changing and there's still confusion on kind of how to navigate. So the gist of this law is that no personal data may be processed unless this processing is done under one of 6 lawful bases, one of which is consent. So again, if we're talking about the free passage of data from a consumer to a platform, a lot of times, if you're signing a contract, there's explicit consent in how in how data is being how someone's data is being used. But basically now, if you're using a platform, it's much more explicit for EU citizens and a technology platform, how that data is being used and being stored. And another important aspect of this, and we'll see this a lot, is that there is some cyber impacts for almost everything legislative and tech, but businesses must report breaches within 72 hours. So regardless of how they are in theory handling data, if a set of data or even a single consumer's data is compromised somehow, there's this kind of new time limit for how you can report that. Companies that violate GDPR can face hefty fines and audits from the EU. We've seen a lot of that within the past couple of years. But the bottom line here, and kind of the ethos of this principle, is that transparency is key. More than before, consumers need to easily know and consent to a company using their personal information. When GDPR came into effect, you probably remember getting a ton of emails from brands with updated privacy policies. Privacy policies are one of the ways that you can really communicate how you're using data to your users. Up next, this is on the US side, this is the California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA. This was signed into law in June 2018. The amendments were in October 2019, and then fully came into effect January 1st of this year, with a grace period until July. So again, very, very new. We're just a couple of months into actual enforcement. CCPA was, I think we can say, heavily inspired by GDPR. It provides California residents with the right to know what personal data is being collected, to be able to say no to the sale of that data, and to have access to that data set. So, so this is, again, a very state-specific issue where consumers have a lot more control over their data than they used to. This applies to businesses that do business within California. Again, this is just a state law, and and those businesses have to satisfy at least one of the following. That being, one has an annual gross revenues in excess of 25 million, or buy or receive personal information for over 50,000 consumers. And then the third one, which is tricky and can apply to a company of any size, is if they earn half of their annual revenue from selling consumers' personal data. So, so an ad company just that's operating in California, if you're taking consumers' data and selling advertisements based on that, doesn't matter how big your company is, that you're going to be subject to CCPA. This has been off to a bit of a rocky start. Again, like I said, there was a grace period through July. We're still really early into enforcement, and some big companies have been accused of, not making the process for consumers to request their data transparent enough. The process can be confusing, and then there's also complications in verifying identity. We want rules in place so that I can't go to a social media and ask for the data of Meredith that I have to be asking for my own. And so in 2021, regardless, we will see a lot more clarity around CCPA. And then the last one that I wanted to very briefly touch on is EU-US Privacy Shield. So this was a framework for regulating transatlantic exchanges of personal data. And this was actually in place of the Safe Harbor Privacy Principles, which was in 2015. So we've had a lot of iterations of kind of these agreements between the EU and the US and how we're sharing EU citizens' data. But in July 2020, so again, just a few months ago, very recent, there was a final decision by the European Court of Justice to strike down this agreement on the grounds that it did not provide adequate protections to EU citizens on government snooping. So this has been a point of contention ever since the Snowden leaks, and again, we're still kind of working this out. Agreements have, it's kind of start-stop, but for now, tech is still kind of scrambling to understand and comply and kind of calculate the uncertainty and risk for enforcement, but it kind of remains in flux. So there are some, agreements in place so that, businesses can continue running smoothly. But again, we will kind of see how this plays out a lot more in 2021. So what does this mean for kind of startups? Again, and kind of how will this play out post-election? So first of all, enforcement is going to remain in flux. So the clarity is coming soon, but right now we don't have all the answers. CCPA especially is still so new, and we'll begin to see cases that will give insights into how the state is looking to enforce. But in the meantime, I would say that knowledge is power. I just went over the basics, but if you have a company and you're unsure that if these kinds of laws will apply to you, you want to, you don't want to be caught flat-footed. There's some really hefty fines involved with this. And so it's important to note kind of, which of all of these laws apply to you or not. The second, if we're kind of looking towards the election and how things might play out, is the role of American protectionism. So I think regardless of politics within the United States, our prediction is that in working out international agreements, that neither Trump nor Biden would necessarily kind of roll over to some of these European demands. So they're both, very big in both rhetoric and policy on being tough on China. And so it's and a lot of the reasoning behind that is protecting American companies from kind of unfair regulation from foreign entities. So I think regardless of Biden or Trump, we will see a bit of pushback within the next couple of years on some of at least the European policies that are applying to US. That said, in terms of kind of consumer privacy, Biden has made some comments that, align him on a little bit more of a stricter view. So again, the CCPA especially, we might see that as a trend under, it is a state issue too, so definitely not, governed by the president, but I think that there's certainly the Democratic view on this is that there might be a little bit more of a stricter approach. So CCPA will probably not be the only state to take a hard look at how we're handling consumer data. But again, I think the goal for anyone is to have state by state legislation like this is really tricky. So I think that there could also definitely be a push for some sort of national reform just so there's, uniform understanding. So we will see. And then the one thing to note for this in compliance and something that I think will definitely kind of continue to touch on in many of these issues is just that for big tech, if we're thinking and where a lot of this is being enforced, compliance is just a drop in the bucket. Regulation and enforcement around consumer privacy policies can have much bigger implications for small businesses and startups. So a big company is going to have a team of lawyers that are fully focused on compliance, lawyers and communicators, fully focused on compliance. So I think it's similar to, I'll get into content moderation in a bit, but that it could disproportionately harm startups. So again, regardless of views on if these issues are important or not, it's really vital that small companies don't think that you'll be exempt from these things, and make sure that you have an action plan for this kind of thing. And that, you know, we're talking politics too, that this is definitely something, you know, if you're looking to, you know, if you're looking to grow and to play in some of these consumer data places, you know, we want to make sure that you're very aware of the ways that that some of these policies are impacting you.
So moving along, well, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the one regulator that we wanted to point out to you at the federal level was the Federal Trade Commission, as being probably the most important for tech startups. So we'll talk a little bit about their leadership and the handling of data breaches. So the mission of the FTC is really all about protecting consumers and ensuring that there are not unfair business practices or anything in play that would prevent competition. And so the FTC is very active. They are they get most of the direction of which they're going when they want to do investigations through complaints. So they have a massive complaint portal that consumers can go in and basically describe what happened to them. And a lot of times that's how the FTC will guide its enforcement program. Also, depending on who's in charge, Republicans or Democrats will take the FTC into different directions. And certainly what has come out of the FTC lately has been involving data breaches and cyber risk under COVID. One of the things to keep in mind is that the FTC is a commission versus an agency. What that means is that there is a chair and there is a group of commissioners that will make rules on certain things the agency is doing and will help guide the direction of the FTC. As a commission, the president doesn't have as much influence as perhaps a cabinet level agency, like say the Department of Defense or Department of Education. If Republicans have control of the FTC, companies often will have more clarity on safe harbors, which basically means that if you're wading into a territory of whether something is legal or illegal or going outside the bounds of regulation, there will often be a lot of safe harbors that will exempt certain behaviors or exempt certain practices that won't get you in hot water. So that's sort of one benefit when Republicans have control. On the flip side, when Democrats are in control of the FTC, certainly much more aggressive and robust investigations and enforcement. Oftentimes, companies can be judged after something happens, and one of the phrases one of our colleagues explains that definitely explains sort of Democratic leadership under the FTC is, you know, using ambiguous language like you took reasonable steps to do something, but turns out you stepped into the wrong place and now you're in hot water. So depending on who's in charge could certainly impact whether or not the FTC might look at you as possible a viable investigation. And Kelly, do you want to talk a little about why having an FTC strategy is so important?
Yeah, definitely. So as Meredith has kind of alluded to, this stuff is important, and I understand the reaction of it might seem silly or like a waste of time to kind of have, you know, a 3-letter government entity on your radar as, you know, a growing small company. But this stuff happens. So truly no company is too small. And we've seen, you know, I'll just kind of talk about for this entire slide. There was a case in 2008 where Tyversa, a cybersecurity firm that specialized in kind of deep web research and helping businesses counteract data breaches, an executive at that firm contacted LabMD, which is a urology testing laboratory, and they claim to have discovered evidence of a major data breach on LabMD's database, and offered to kind of sell the company these monitoring services to counteract the breach. And when LabMD declined to purchase services, Tyversa allegedly then leaked the information about the breach to the FTC. LabMD ended up collapsing from legal costs in 2014, and even later, you know, actually a judge eventually throughout the case due to lack of evidence. But you know, there are definitely some positive ways to work with the government, but this is also something to keep in mind. Just because you're small and have a data breach does not mean that you don't potentially have competitors who are, you know, would do anything for an edge and might, you know, weaponize your lack of action, you know, lack of research and development and cyber or other sort of compliance against you. So the lesson here is that no company is too small, and having a strategy either way is really important. Yeah, I think the rest of this slide basically, yeah, applies to all of this. So. Okay, moving on then to the potential for increased antitrust scrutiny. So you might have seen, this might be kind of on most folks' radars. Again, I know we had a little bit of talk about how closely we're following presidential election things, but right now the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Antitrust, it's the U.S. House Antitrust Commercial and Administrative Law Subcommittee, is leading an investigation into big tech and competition. This is led by the chairman, Representative David Cicilline, and this has been going on for over a year. So there's been a series of 6 hearings, the last of which probably was on most folks' radar. That was the, you know, quote unquote Zoom trial, where we had the major executives from Apple, Google, Amazon, and Facebook all testifying remotely. And so this was, you know, really kind of this showstopper moment, but this investigation has been going on for over a year. It's a series of hearings, like I said, on online platforms and market power. And the report of this investigation is expected within the next few weeks, probably this month or next. Cicilline will said the report will provide, and this is a quote from him, a menu of legislation and regulatory proposals. So regardless of outcome and enforcement, there will be, you know, either a Biden or a Trump administration will have, you know, this kind of menu of options to go on. We obviously don't know what that report could look like, and I'll kind of get into a minute of how that might, you know, apply to some smaller startups. But regardless of the president, there's the potential for some major change in the way that we look at and regulate antitrust. Wanted to kind of just very briefly touch on the concept of hipster antitrust. This refers to the movement to shift the focus of antitrust law to the maximization of consumer welfare. We talked about this with data earlier. It's no longer kind of cut and dry. The old definition kind of states that overall consumer welfare is basically if consumers are paying more than they're being harmed. But if we're thinking about, you know, the way that we interact with social media, for example, it's not necessarily, it's a lot, hipster antitrust argues that it's a lot more difficult to argue how consumers are being impacted if it can't be calculated with the dollar amount. So the consumer welfare standard generally states that overall consumer welfare and economic efficiency should be the main criterion, like I said, but, you know, for evaluating a merger. But what increased scrutiny might look like, and if you could hit again, Meredith. So basically, yeah, just to what increased scrutiny could look like is that regardless of the outcome, you know, the way that so in a few months, we might be looking at antitrust in a very different way. It's going to take a while, of course, to sort some things out. But regardless, the increased scrutiny is already having an indirect impact. So, some folks call this the kind of policeman at the elbow effect, where they're, you know, Uber, for example, there's been rumors that they passed on acquiring a larger food delivery service in order to acquire Postmates. So that's, you know, with fears, of course, of kind of antitrust regulation. So so this could be harmful, I think, for small competitors in terms of, acquisition and investment. Larger companies under increased scrutiny either way, could be, there's just a little bit more, antitrust regulation either way. So, yeah, and then I think we can move on. Yeah. Then, okay, moving on next to complications. Again, I'm gonna try to be pretty quick because I know we want time for questions. But the other big topic that we're gonna focus on is content moderation and in Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. So basically we're talking about the way that that a platform is responsible and liable for content that users put forward on that platform. So this could be as simple as a comment section, or as complicated as, regulating an entire social media platform. Who basically is responsible for quote unquote bad content? So there have been a number of proposals to kind of change Section 230, and again, I won't go into kind of all the details here, but there's on both sides of the aisle, there's want and need, or at least a growing momentum to change this. So right now there is a pretty vague but overarching shield from platforms to be able to kind of have they won't be held liable by what their users are saying. And so there's a couple ways that this could update. So there have been, in just the past about a year or two, there have been a couple bills in motion, some of which have stalled a bit, some of which are still, very early and could pick up under new presidencies, could pick up again. But there's definitely some momentum for changing the ways that companies are held liable. So what's important for startups here is the impact on smaller companies. Just like we were discussing earlier with, the concept of having to comply with some with consumer data privacy rules. There's also a lot of this complying with, regulating whether it's a comment section or if your entire platform leverages user content. It's going to be a lot more difficult for smaller companies to do this. Some of the reform possibilities take into account the size of a company, but some do not. And again, there's on both sides of the aisle, I think that we could see different approaches to reforming this, or potentially keeping in place the way that companies are held liable today. But that will definitely come into a clearer focus in the next year.
Thanks, Kelly. And just to wrap up for number 7, we'll talk a little bit about the CARES Act and the general pandemic response that your company takes should be carefully considered. The reason for that is we want you to think politically, and not necessarily big P, Republican, Democrat, but little p. What are the political implications for you long term if you decide to take advantage of something in the short term? And what we're talking about specifically with regards to the CARES Act, for example, is there are a lot of programs to help your business to deal with the impact of COVID, and whether that's applying for funds to pay your employees, to take out emergency loans. There's certainly benefits to helping your company stay afloat as this pandemic continues. However, there might also be some drawbacks that you should be aware of. Some of the questions you should ask yourself is, how will my customer base view my business? Will they view me negatively because I've decided to take public funds? How this will impact my reputation. We know that when there was a list that was released, I believe, from the Treasury Department and the Small Business Administration, that listed everyone who took the PPP money, which was money that companies could apply for to pay the salaries of their employees. And immediately the press jumped on companies that were affiliated with celebrities like Kanye West or Robert De Niro, or jumped on companies that were associated with politicians. Maybe it was their family's auto dealership business. Hopefully you guys won't be in a situation like that, but it is possible. And as Kelly mentioned earlier, that, you know, just because you're small doesn't mean you're immune. So certainly you want to think about what could be a longer term implication of taking funding. And then also, what are your competition or peers doing? If your competition or peers is not taking money, are they going to come at you because you are, or other way around, right? Is an opportunity for you who didn't take money to then, you know, stick it to your peers in competition who did. So just something to think about, that just because you did something in the short term might not realize in that sort of short term effects, but actually the longer term could impact you both negatively or positively. And one of the things to keep in mind is if you are going to take federal funds, keep in mind that there could be some reputational risk for you. There's going to be opportunities for the government to do enhanced oversight, and the government could take a look at your business operations beyond just taking the money. There's a lot of great examples out there that happened after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and how the government, in a sense, many people would argue, overreached on their oversight and investigation authority into companies who took money, and really harmed those companies by assigning high fines, and of course getting negative press. So those are some things that, you know, even being small, you should also think about just in case. And then finally, you know, you've probably heard in the news that there's been opportunities for everyone to get their acts together and pass something to provide more financial benefits and support to companies and to people at this time. But at the moment, there is not sort of the next phase. And so we're anticipating there to be another phase in the near term, in addition to the fact that government funding is going to run out in 16 days, that some sort of funding mechanism is going to have to be passed. So we think that there's something coming soon, but then also depending on who wins the election and what the priorities are of Biden or Trump, we will also see perhaps more opportunities there as well. And so just to wrap up, Kelly, do you want to take this slide?
Yeah. So I know we went through a lot very quickly, and that was the idea. Where, you know, as we said, we'd love if you would drop your email in the chat. We'll be collecting all of those so that we can stay in touch. But also feel free to reach out to either of us individually. But yeah, we went over a lot today, and I think that, you know, I think that the most important thing, at least Meredith, what I'm thinking is just like knowledge is power with a lot of this, and just because you're small doesn't mean that you're exempt. And so knowing what resources are available to you, knowing the potential changes in legislation, that there might be, you know, some conflicts now for, you know, something like privacy today, but that might change down the road, that being aware of all that is really important. So I know that I said if you have any specific questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we might be able to answer a couple of them now.
Yeah, Kelly, I have one for you.
Oh yes, of course.
Yeah. So it says, so I think it's Arsalan Khan had a question. It says, at the federal level, the U.S. doesn't have an equivalent of GDPR. Any talks of making a privacy act at the federal level?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And like I said, on the US side, I was really kind of only focusing on the state of California. There potentially, so there's a couple different things that could happen. There might be, in order to kind of have this more international agreement, there might be a couple of changes at the US. One is that a general kind of privacy change over, you know, more clarity on how data is being handled for consumers, for, you know, both EU and around the world. Something that there just might be some compromise when working with the EU in terms of what might make them what might make EU regulators a bit more comfortable with the interoperability of data between the EU and the US. So one thing to mention is that the way that kind of the consumers are monitored is an aspect to all of this. But in terms of a GDPR equivalent in the US, I think that that's much more possible under a Biden administration. As I mentioned briefly, he's made comments, about that EU has, takes a positive approach to the way that consumer data is handled. That said, again, this isn't the kind of thing that we would be necessarily bullied into. I think, the concept of American protectionism, like I was saying, we definitely would not move towards a GDPR equivalent just because we're getting pressure from like international pressure. This would be very US consumer centric on making sure that we're protecting the data and maximizing the rights of the US consumer. But I think that there's a couple ways that we might see, a national change for data, again, so that there's more clarity. But I think that that's definitely much more possible under a Biden administration. And what will be key to that is kind of seeing how the California CCPA is enforced, see how that goes. If there's less barriers to entry, I think there's a much more of a larger possibility that there could be some sort of national regulation.
Thanks, Kelly. And then just looking through the questions here, and I see Leon had a couple of comments. One of them was about establishing relationships with local politicians. Couldn't agree more. Unfortunately, we didn't have the time to kind of dive into more of like a state and local level for this presentation, but I think that's absolutely an important strategy, and thank you for flagging that. And then Leon, you also said one of the issues that you I think is going to be important for this election and going forward are taxes and financial services. And I think that's also, I think you're also on point, especially on the tax side. Definitely on the corporate tax side, Biden, if he wins, has made lots of comments about wanting to increase the corporate tax from the prior tax bill that was passed a couple years ago. So it'll be interesting to see, does that happen? Is there appetite for that? But also, when would that happen, right? Because we're at this phase where, companies need to rehire people, they need to grow, and is that how much, that's going to be an impediment. So it'll be sort of interesting to see where that goes. And then I think there was a question here for you, Kelly, on, I think it was net neutrality. Let me see if I can find the actual question.
Oh, good. It might have went to, I'm seeing some.
Yeah, take whatever one you want. I just thought that was a cool one.
No, I haven't seen it. So if there is, net neutrality. Okay, I see it now. So that's definitely something that we could see coming back to the forefront under a Biden administration. It's an issue that definitely gets some folks very riled up. And one thing that FTI that we're looking at is, the potential, especially kind of what moves Biden might make in the first 100 days. And so in a Biden presidency, I think that there could definitely be, net neutrality might come up again, and that could definitely be revisited because it's an issue that people are very passionate about, that a lot of his base is very passionate about. So could certainly see a change coming about under a Biden administration. A second Trump term, probably not.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Kelly and Meredith, for a wonderful presentation today. We appreciate you taking the time to be and present at DC Startup Week. Thank you for all the attendees for being here as well. Quick things, we have 2 sessions coming up at 2 about how do you grow your company in the midst of chaos, as well as how do you build your reputation from the ground up. So we hope that you join us on that. On the Attendify, on the activity stream, please feel free to share any insights or ask any questions directly to Kelly and Meredith. They're both listed as speakers, so you always can send them a private message if you have any other things from them that you might want. So thank you so much to Kelly and Meredith. We appreciate your time and being here. So if everyone can please give you a round of applause.
Thank you so much.
Guys, thanks for having us.